Soviet invaders have captured the town of Earlton in northern Ontario. They're steadily expanding the area they control against weak Canadian resistance.
Okay, 1 second. Open fire with me.
Meanwhile, Canadian paratroops from the Special Service Force are preparing to move in and recapture Earlton. Canada depends mostly on airborne troops to deal with enemy incursions. The most important possession any nation has is its territory. Canada lives in a very safe part of the world, but it accepts the universal rule. If you're not willing and able to defend your territory, then you're not a country at all. So these paratroops are going to jump into the fields around Earlton and liberate it from the pretend Russians. They'll attack in the morning.
Elevation 225, load! 225.
Let's face it, though, the Russians are not coming, at least not on foot.
Yet what these troops are training for here, they may one day have to do for real, on another continent 5,000 miles away. If they do, it won't be new. In this century, proportionately more Canadians have died in war overseas than Americans.
And that's what this series is about, how Canada came to see itself as a player in the great power game, and acquired an army that fights anywhere but here. Royal Roads Military Academy, 6 a.m.
Recruit Ames! When you come out in the hall to pick something up. Stand easy. You don't just step out and pick it up.
You're slowing down! You're supposed to be speeding up!
I told you last
This is how we train our future military leaders.
in the layout.
The cadets respond well to the training. They're hardworking, enthusiastic, and patriotic.
It makes me feel good to know that I'm doing something that I'll be there if Canada ever wants me or needs me for whatever, that I'll be able to do something besides sit back at home and watch it on TV and go, oh no.
If Canada is ever involved in a war, I feel that we're smart enough to know that it's that important, and I'll be more than proud to fight for it. But that's not why I joined. I think that regardless of whether you're in the armed forces right now or not, and there's a war, you're all going to be gone anyways.
If there's another world war, our armed forces won't be able to save us. So why do we spend over $9 billion a year on them?
Just hold on, don't touch your hand. Okay? The inside of the mask. Just before you don the mask on, do the inside of the mask. Do not remove the decon mitt. Keep it on. Straight up, straight up. Straight up.
In this area!
Straight up. Straight up.
Clear it out. It's going to go away very quickly.
This all seems very silly. A group of inoffensive young Canadians on a pleasant summer afternoon learning how to deal with nerve gas. This is Victoria, BC, for God's sake. There hasn't been a major battle fought within 2,000 miles of here in all human history. Yet the Canadian Armed Forces are a very serious organization. They're the expression of Canada's willingness to fight wars.
We believe, rightly or wrongly, that it's necessary to kill foreigners from time to time to protect our interests, and it's got to be a habit. The Canadian Armed Forces have killed well over 100,000 foreigners in this century.
The wood line just up there where that creek is, I imagine. Yeah. Our section just sees that. Move right when
But it's all happened a long way from home. In this century, the Canadian forces have fought in Germany, Italy, Korea, Belgium, Hong Kong, France, and Russia. At the moment, we're in the NATO alliance, and we're planning to fight in Germany.
How far do you have to go with your unit?
To Shoreline.
To Schoning, yeah.
Okay?
Okay.
Is that good enough there?
Yes, and I call my umpire, my master umpire, what to do.
Okay.
All right?
Okay, so we can let them go.
No, wait for him.
In 5 minutes.
No, wait a minute. Let the first 6 be dead. First 6 APCs. I think it...
4.
5.
5.
Well, to put it as bluntly as possible, what does it feel like to get killed?
No one likes to die, particularly not a good Canadian soldier.
Yeah, but I mean, quite seriously, I mean, you are rehearsing what you might do, and you know, and the soldiers know, they're being sort of judged dead, and they must know this is much like what would happen in the real thing.
I don't think anyone has any illusions that we're going to live all the way through the next war. Everyone's going to try their best and do it as long as possible. However, in any war, someone's got to die, and that's just what we're here for, I would imagine.
Do you like your job?
I like it a lot.
Despite that? I mean, how does I believe you like your job, but how do those two things go together?
Well, for one thing, I don't think that we're going to have a war in the next few years. At least I'm hoping we're not going to have a war in the next few years. But if we did, and I've been getting paid for the last 10 or 15 years now without a war, then it's my duty to go and fight the good fight.
Pay your dues.
That's correct.
I don't want to get involved in politics. We're here to serve our country. And the moment you're not willing to do what you're ordered to, you should do the honorable thing and quit.
But I want the whole platoon to bias left because we're going to move towards this village on the left. And if you look there, you can see there's more wood line and hedgerows.
Our armed forces want a service, and we want to believe that they do. But when they're doing it thousands of miles away as part of an alliance of 16 different nations, it's difficult to see exactly how they're defending Canada.
Get back across the bridge. I'll call you forward, then you move your whole section.
Why don't we just concentrate on defending ourselves? There are countries that do just that, and it's worth taking a look at one. There happens to be one just 60 miles down the road from where the Canadian forces are based in Germany. It's called Switzerland. Switzerland doesn't join any alliances, but it's not pacifist. If all of Europe wants to go to war around Switzerland, that's their business. But if anybody wants to use Swiss territory in their war, they'll fight them.
Schademöglichkeiten an die Hauptachse und umgekehrt.
Every Swiss male is trained as a soldier and practices regularly. Switzerland has adopted a policy of heavily armed neutrality, and as a result, not one Swiss has been killed in a foreign war for the past 170 years. If Canada had adopted the Swiss model a generation ago, instead of helping to create NATO, we'd have no troops here in Europe today, and we wouldn't let any other country's armed forces enter our own territory or airspace. Instead, we'd have universal conscription and be able to mobilize an army of 2.5 million men. That's about twice as many as the entire United States Army. We'd also have to have at least a limited ability to defend our own coasts and skies, and all that still wouldn't make us a credible neutral. Neutrality works for Switzerland, mainly because nobody has much reason to invade it. The Swiss mountains are not the quickest military route to anywhere. But Canada is strategic territory. We're on the direct route from the Soviet Union to the United States, so neutrality would not save us in wartime.
20! Go! Fight!
Neutrality is impossible unless you want to be entirely beholden to the Americans. If we are neutral, then we may expect to be invaded by the Americans in time of war. They couldn't permit the Canada to be truly neutral. They would have to occupy us.
Canada will inevitably be involved in the next World War simply because we live next to the United States. But that doesn't explain why we join foreign alliances and keep troops in Europe. Those habits come from our history, which has been entangled with the United States from the beginning. Except that back then, the Americans were not our allies. They were the enemy. When the Americans invaded, as they did in 1775 and then again in 1812, Canadian volunteers helped to fight them off. In fact, French-Canadian militia saved Montreal at the Battle of Chateauguay. Most of Canada's people in those days were French Canadians who had no great love for Britain. But they were very afraid of being swallowed up by the US, and Canada was too weak to defend itself alone. So there was a kind of unspoken bargain. French Canadians accepted British rule, and in return the British defended Canada. Until just over a century ago, the British kept about as many troops in Canada guarding our frontiers as there were in the whole US regular army. The original bargain remained in effect even after Ontario and the West began filling up with English-speaking immigrants. Canada still had no army of its own when the expanding US, having gobbled up half of Mexico, turned its attention north again in the 1850s. One summer day in 1859 on San Juan Island off the southern BC coast, a bold young pig from the Hudson's Bay Company's stock farm made a bid for freedom. He crawled under the fence and found himself in a potato patch belonging to one Mr. Cutler, an American citizen. He behaved as pigs will, and Mr. Cutler, a man of very little patience, shot him. Adding insult to injury, he then cooked and ate him. And when the Justice of the Peace appointed by the Governor of B.C. arrived to arrest him, accompanied by Mr. Dallas, the Governor's son-in-law, Mr. Cutler jammed his rifle barrel up Mr. Dallas's nose and ordered them both off his property. Within a week, 100 U.S. troops had landed on the island to back Cutler up, and the first British Marines arrived the following day. Soon there were 5,000 British and American troops around San Juan Island. The confrontation became known as the Pig War. It lasted for 13 years.
Ready, aim, fire!
There was never really any shooting in the Pig War. That's just for the tourists. In the end, to our horror, the British handed San Juan Island over to the Americans peacefully.
You are now, as representatives of Her Britannic Majesty Queen Victoria, are trespassing upon sovereign territory of the United States of America.
But Canada went on trusting in the might of the British Empire to protect it. Hardly anybody realized that Britain was no longer willing to fight a major war to defend us, even though almost all the British regular troops were pulled out of Canada by 1871. We still kept nothing except a ramshackle militia organization. Canada didn't lose much territory as a result, because by the late 19th century, the United States was outgrowing its juvenile ambition to rule all of North America. But the enduring Canadian illusion of being defended by Britain did have a price. It meant that Canada also felt an obligation to defend Britain. The bill came due in 1899. War broke out in South Africa, and London asked Canada to send troops. French Canadians were reluctant. This hadn't been any part of the original bargain. But London hinted that we wouldn't even get British diplomatic support against the Americans if we didn't go along. Besides, there was now an English-speaking majority in Canada, and a lot of them cheered whenever you waved the British flag. So Prime Minister Laurier agreed to pay for Canadian volunteers to go to South Africa. About 8,000 Canadians served in South Africa, almost all of them Anglophones, and 224 died there. It could have been a lot worse, but this was where we first fell into our habit of sending troops abroad. And it would get a lot worse. When the next Imperial War came along in 1914, Canada automatically found itself at war with Germany. This time, with an English-Canadian Prime Minister, Sir Robert Borden, there was no hesitation about sending troops, and there was no shortage of volunteers.
We were all a bunch of young people, eh? I was about the youngest one that was in the crowd, you know, but I took it as an adventure, you know. Because the story was that we'd never see the war because it'd be all over by the time we got over to England.
Do you remember why you joined up?
Spirit of adventure, mostly, I think, at that time. Because I don't think one had any idea what was ahead, you know. And I think that was about the only thing that interested me then, was to see the world.
Canada was in no danger, and most of the volunteers realized that. They simply felt a reflex loyalty to Britain. English Canada was still heavily an immigrant country.
Victoria still has a reputation for being the most British of Canadian cities, but 70 years ago, practically the whole Canadian West was peopled by first and second generation immigrants from England. In 1914, there were only 1.2 million people in Manitoba, Alberta, and British Columbia, a mere sixth of Canada's total population. But this is where the Canadian Army came from in the First World War. Almost half the volunteers were from the West.
Yes, I was at the station because I can remember how far they leant out the windows, waving to the people, and the way the mothers and the wives would try to clasp their hands as they went, as the train drew out very slowly. And this lament going on in the background. You'll, you know, come back again, yes.
The wave of volunteering reached its peak in the small towns of Alberta.
Here in Strathmore, every eligible man joined the army in the fall of 1914, except one. And he was ready to go, so the paper said, as soon as the harvest was in. Strathmore had only been settled 9 years before, and almost all the settlers were from Britain. They were going back to fight for their mother country.
I was born in England, in Warwickshire. I come to Canada in 1912. I joined in Wilkie, Saskatchewan.
I came from England, Folkestone, down in Kent. I came in 12.
And when did you join the army?
In 14.
Did you go overseas at once?
At once, yes. For the first contingent, we went down to Montreal, and we shipped from 32 boatloads. At that time, we were one of the biggest convoys that had ever crossed the Atlantic.
Why did you join in 14?
Well, I think it was, as I look back at it, genuine patriotism. Maybe I changed my mind afterwards, after we got there, but at the time, I think it was genuine.
Was it, you'd only been in Canada 2 years?
2 years, sure, so I was looking at it probably from an English point of view.
Right from the start, English Canadian newspapers began muttering about how few French Canadians were joining the army. But the difference in the early days was mostly an illusion. As Laurier pointed out in August, only 18% of that month's volunteers were Canadian-born at all. The other 82% were English-born or foreign-born. However, in the East, where there were few British immigrants, the Army depended heavily on the rich and powerful, almost all of them Canadian-born, to raise volunteer regiments. But then the fortunes of the rich and powerful in Canada often depended on British favour. The most extreme example was Premier Edward Morris of Newfoundland, who raised a regiment of volunteers for Britain at the very outbreak of war. The British said, "Thank you very much," and promptly shipped them off to Turkey. The Royal Newfoundland Regiment came ashore here at Suvla Bay in September 1915 and started losing men right away. There were no great offensives. What they found was the wretched and mindless routine of trench warfare. Their enthusiasm soon drained away, and many of them began to notice how odd it was for Newfoundland fishermen to be machine-gunned by Turkish peasants in the eastern Mediterranean. Private John Galashaw, who was wounded here, recalled a conversation that took place one night in the trenches. It was freezing cold, and the men were talking about why they'd joined. Art Pratt said, "Some of you enlisted so full of love of country, there was patriotism running down your chin, and some of you enlisted because you were disappointed in love. But the most of you enlisted for love of adventure, and you're getting it." Then a voice drifted up from the next dugout. "There's only one reason any of us enlisted, and that's pure, low-down, unmitigated ignorance." Not all Newfoundlanders were acting out of ignorance, though. Premier Edward Morris never went to Suvla Bay, of course, but in 1917 he traveled to England. The British made him a member of the House of Lords as his reward for raising the Newfoundland Regiment. So Morris settled in England and sent his resignation home by mail. By 1917, Canada had 4 full divisions in France, fighting under their own Canadian commander, a real army. But the Western Front used men up in huge numbers, and as a result, raw recruits were being rushed into battle without proper training.
Found myself in a shell hole with some infantrymen, and looking over 100 yards or so away, there was a German standing up out of the shell hole, sort of shooting like this, as if he was shooting at rabbits. I don't know whether he hit anybody, but at any rate, he was there, and I said, why don't you fire at that man? "Oh, I don't know how to fire." he just couldn't use the rifle. So I took the rifle from him and took a shot, and the man disappeared. I don't suppose I hit him, but at any rate, he wasn't there.
By now, the Army depended almost entirely on Canadian-born volunteers to replace its losses, and there simply weren't enough of them. The problem came to a head at the Battle of Vimy Ridge in April 1917. Vimy Ridge was a famous Canadian victory, and cheap as those things went in 1917. Canadians captured it in a single day at a cost of only 4,000 killed and 6,000 wounded. But even that was too many for a volunteer army. Will Bird of the 42nd Battalion Royal Highlanders of Canada reached the top of the ridge just at dusk.
2 hours later, we found 14 platoon, hardly recognizing it. The sergeant was there and MacDonald, but most of the others were strangers. Beliveau and Jenkins and Joe McPherson had been killed in one area. One shell had wiped out Stevenson and 2 others. Gilroy and Westcott and Legg had been killed by machine gun fire.
The war had started out as an adventure for volunteers only, but by now their relatives at home felt that everybody else should be forced to share their risks.
The casualty lists were never printed until during the next week. And I can remember the appalling lines down the paper. And you look at it, you know, watching for the names that you knew.
How did people in the West feel about conscription?
Well, I think they were all for it. Because after all, the flower of the flock was taken.
In the fighting of April and May 1917, the Canadian Corps lost 24,000 casualties, and recruitment at home was only 11,000.
The enthusiasm of the early days was long gone. Too many families had already lost a son or a husband. Units at the front were being broken up for lack of reinforcements. So with the greatest reluctance, Borden's government finally raised the poisonous issue of conscription.
He felt a tremendous obligation to the troops in this army that had been built up and had been so successful. He thought that having his boys reinforced was necessary for Canada's defense, which he regarded as being across the ocean.
It didn't matter much to Canada who won the war between the European empires. French Canadians saw that clearly enough because they felt no instinctive loyalty to either side. But then most French Canadians didn't have sons at the front.
There was a bitterly fought election over conscription in 1917. Borden won with the help of some changes in the election rules, like giving women the vote for the first time, provided they were the relatives of serving soldiers. But he won at the cost of splitting the country. 2/3 of English speakers voted for conscription, and 3/4 of French speakers voted against it. Conscription was not all that dreadful for French Canada in practice. Fewer than 5,000 French-speaking conscripts ever got to the front. But the principle that the English-speaking majority could force French Canadian kids to fight in Britain's wars was intolerable. There were savage anti-conscription riots in Quebec City in 1918, and a Toronto infantry regiment was brought in to put them down. If the war had gone on for another year or two, the country might have broken up. But it didn't. The war ended in late 1918. Canada even got to sign the peace treaty in its own name, though the word Canada was suitably indented to show that we were still formally part of the British Empire. However, the real measure of independence is the ability to say no. In that sense, Canada's declaration of independence was made less than 4 years after the war ended, over a crisis taking place in a grubby provincial town in Turkey.
In 1922, British troops were on the brink of war just outside this little town of Çanak. A plan to partition Turkey among the victors of the First World War had gone wrong, and the British government was unwilling to lose gracefully. So London prepared for war and sent a cable to Ottawa asking for troops. It was clumsily done. The Canadian government had no forewarning of the crisis, and the request for Canadian help was published by the British papers even before the cable was decoded in Ottawa. Prime Minister Mackenzie King first learned of it when a reporter asked him what he was going to do about it. But over the previous few years, we learned a lot about the cost of fighting in the Empire's wars, and we were finally beginning to think in terms of our own national interests. Mackenzie King just told London politely that the Canadian Parliament would have to be consulted before we sent troops anywhere. But what he really meant was, don't call us, we'll call you.
The First World War had taught Mackenzie King a lesson. No more foreign adventures in the service of other people's interests. But our soldiers were eager to go. The new Canadian General Staff bustled about making plans to send Canada's entire regular army to Turkey at once, and followed up with a force of 200,000 Canadian volunteers until King stopped it. Our most lasting inheritance from the First World War is real armed forces. And the thing about armed forces is they require enemies to justify their existence. The fact that we ran out of enemies who might actually attack Canada before we acquired professional armed forces didn't trouble our military planners at all. They simply adopted Britain's enemies as their own. In fact, they practically became British themselves.
When I joined the Royal Canadian Navy 25 years ago, I had no idea how naval officers were supposed to behave, but the Navy knew exactly what to do. It taught me how to navigate a ship and which toast to offer at mess dinners. The one I liked best was Thursday's toast, a bloody war in a sickly season, with the idea that lots of deaths in the senior ranks would hasten promotion. And in every spare moment, the Navy showed us a film called The Cruel Sea. I must have seen that movie a dozen times.
She could have been sunk, don't you think, sir? I wish to heaven you mind your own business and get on with your job.
It was a very good movie about British corvettes in the Battle of the Atlantic during the Second World War. Exactly the same battle the Canadian Navy fought in using the same small ships. And what I learned from that movie and from how everybody acted around me was to model my behavior on the British Navy.
After the war, I'll be as sweet as you like to everybody. Including you.
I loved it, and sometimes alone on the bridge at night, scenes from The Cruel Sea would play in the back of my head. And I would never have admitted it at the time, of course. But the really significant thing is that when my work took me to England years later, I spent quite a lot of time at sea with the British Naval Reserves, and I didn't have to learn a single new thing. I fitted in perfectly. It was the same Navy.
You know, we had our several little mutinies in the 50s, and they were all saying to the leaders of the Navy of the day, hey, we want to be Canadian. And, you know, we had several of them. They sort of didn't end up in bloodshed or keel hauling or hanging from the yardarm. But we had several very serious protests, I guess they'd be called today, by our sailors. And they were basically saying, hey, we're not British, we're Canadians. Let's identify as Canadians, let's act as Canadians.
It's no longer the same Navy. Our armed forces are thoroughly Canadian now. But they're not out of a job because Canada finds its own enemies now. The First World War started the process of turning us into a player in the great power game, and the Second World War completed it. The Canadian Armed Forces certainly didn't drag us into the Second World War. Before 1939, they were so tiny that they had practically no influence at all. It was the myths and obsessions of the Canadian public, formed mostly in the First World War, that got us into the Second, despite everything Mackenzie King could do. For most of the time between the two world wars, our Prime Minister was Mackenzie King, the man who said no at Chanak. He was a strange man, but a very astute politician. And like a lot of other Canadian politicians and diplomats, King didn't want Canada to get involved in any foreign wars.
Between classes and between races, so ultimately will we further peace and goodwill among the nations of the world.
Yet when the Second World War came, Canada went in right away. Why? I think a large part of the answer is written up on our war memorials from the First World War. If the names of all the Canadians killed on the battlefields of Europe had been carved here when King George dedicated the cenotaph in 1939, there would already have been 60,000 names.
It is a spontaneous, inspired tribute, a moment of mass and individual exaltation. The tremendous throng is suddenly identified with the spirit of the monument that has just been unveiled. And in the words just spoken by the King, the very soul of the nation is here revealed.
Mackenzie King personally believed that we must never get sucked into another European war, but it was the British King who had popular feeling behind him. English Canada was defined as a nation by its terrible losses in the First World War. 1/5 of English Canadian men of military age had been killed or wounded on the far side of the Atlantic in only 4 years.
Most people had to believe that a sacrifice on that scale was about something important, so we've justified it by creating a kind of imaginary Canadian frontier somewhere in Europe. It almost sounds logical. We fought a war in Europe, and we're still free, so we have to fight more wars in Europe to stay free. Mackenzie King still didn't want to fight, but you can't argue with that kind of emotion.
He, I think, saw long before a lot of the rest of us did, who are dubious about getting into a war, that
with the composition of our population as it was in 1939, it would have been impossible to stay out. That it would have had nothing to do with interests, it had to do with emotions. English Canadians in the, as late as 1939, were the dominant element, much more than their numbers. Their influence and their importance was such that it would have been, I think, quite impossible. I think I recognized that myself in 1939, very sadly.
Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. Britain declared war on September 3rd, and Canada followed on September 7th. But the old problem began to resurface at once, especially in French Canada.
Independent member of the British Commonwealth of Nations voted to follow England into the war.
When Canada decided to declare war on Germany, because it so happened that the Germans had invaded Poland, well, a great many people were saying to themselves, now what's this? Why should we be involved with Poland, which is a country that's so far away from us? Why should we not do what the Americans are doing? There were a great many people who were thinking that way.
But Mackenzie King had no choice politically. Once in the war, King's greatest objective was to keep our military commitments as limited as possible. And luckily for King, the British didn't ask Canada for a huge army. Instead, they wanted us to train flyers from all over the Empire, the Commonwealth Air Training Plan.
The United Kingdom government has informed us that participation in the air training scheme would provide for more effective assistance toward ultimate victory than any other form of military cooperation which Canada can give.
Well, actually, he was very distressed when Chamberlain proposed the air training plan, the proposal hadn't been made earlier, because he felt that if it had been made earlier, he could have reduced the army component, or delayed it at any rate. And it was the army that he recognized as the threat to the country itself. I mean, no one objected to the Air Force, and nobody thought you'd ever conscript anybody for the Air Force, and nor for the Navy, for that matter.
Anything was preferable to suffering high Canadian casualties overseas. That would eventually lead to conscription, and conscription could break Canada apart. King's limited war was a success for a long time. For millions of Canadians coming out of the Depression of the 30s, it was a very good war.
Before the war, several years before, we had very high level of unemployment. After 1939, it wasn't very long before the Ford Motor Company received contracts to build trucks, military trucks, and other military vehicles. And in no time, by the middle of 1940, we were experiencing almost full employment.
The war turned Canada into a modern industrial country. Whole new industries sprang up, and our gross national product more than doubled. At the Malton Aircraft plant, they built heavy bombers.
When did you come to work here, Jay?
I started in 1943.
How old were you then?
I was 17.
Can you tell me what it was like here then?
It was very nice. We had mostly female employees. We did have the odd disabled person, but they were very fine workers. We didn't have a coffee break. We had canteens every second little corner. And we had a dance hall at lunchtime upstairs. It used to be called the details building. That's just in the office above us.
Did you go dancing there at the lunch hour?
Every lunchtime. I also had two sisters working here. I worked in the heat treat, and my sisters were Rosie the Riveters, you know. And they were only about 5 foot tall, and the guns were as big as they were. But the job I had, I'd get the rivets out of the bath and run them on the floor. I can tell you every corner of this building.
You'd actually run with the rivets?
I would run, yeah. At 17, you had a little more speed.
What were you paid in the war?
Oh, I think I got about $53 a week, but that was big money in those days.
Contact port outer. Contact port inner.
Canada had a crucial role at that point. I do remember that this was reflected in the fact that Mr. King was treated not only as a very important person, but the most important person to be in London at that time. He was given every kind of honor by Mr. Churchill and the British government. But the priorities were not that Canada was to provide the cannon fodder.
Canada's war effort is a voluntary effort. It is the free expression of a free people.
Canada's main role in the war was to produce the weapons and get them over to Europe. A large share of the escort duties in the North Atlantic fell to the Royal Canadian Navy. The North Atlantic weather was almost as great an enemy as the German submarines, but it was precisely the kind of war our tiny professional Navy had been designed for, keeping open the sea lanes to Britain in a European war.
It was rather a clean way to fight a war in many ways at sea. I was mainly engaged in anti-submarine warfare, and on a sub you can't see who's in a submarine, whether he's submerged or on the surface, so there wasn't anything very personal about it. Most of the U-boats were manned by old-style naval officers. Many of them in the Navy were not Nazis at all, certainly not in the early days of war. And they were a pretty decent bunch. Their Navy had been fashioned after the British Navy, more or less.
I knew that there was a submarine within 50 miles or thereabouts because we knew that the ship had been damaged, but I didn't know where he was. As a matter of fact, I was in my cabin reading an interesting book. So I finished the paragraph, rather exciting part, jumped into my sea boots, went up the bridge, and took over the watch, and then the next thing I know, the ship disintegrated. And then we started to list to starboard rather rapidly. And this is all a matter of seconds. Everything's flying in all directions. Then the ship capsized. I was sitting on the bill's kill on the bottom. Then when I reckoned it was time to leave, I was in no rush. It was cold. Sailors were waving at me, and so I swam for it.
How many men did die?
Not too many, fortunately, because it happened at the dinner hour. The only people that were killed were back aft and the officers off watch. Everybody else was up for it.
But the main target of the U-boats was not the escorting warships at all. It was the merchant vessels and their cargoes. During the war, Canada built up a 600-ship navy to protect the convoy routes across the Atlantic to Britain. But the Navy lost fewer than 2,000 dead in the whole war. If you'd drawn up a balance sheet for Canada's participation in the war in mid-1943, it would have been quite clear that Mackenzie King's strategy was succeeding. Canada was booming industrially, and the only Canadians who were getting killed in large numbers were the aircrew who flew day and night from bases like this all over southern England.
When you first join a squadron, nobody talks to you because they don't expect you to be around very long. If you got through your first 5 trips, then you became more or less an accepted fact. There was a bit of hope for you. So somebody would begin to take you on with not close friendship, but at least they would talk to you. And then after a month or so, you would get into the mess with a group that had probably 10 trips in. And you stayed with those people, and they're the only ones you remember. You never knew the new guys coming in, because it wasn't worth your effort to get to know them. It was rather a sad society.
Wireless off okay, Skip. On track. Okay, fella.
What's actually the experience when you're getting the flak?
Rather a lonely feeling. You'd wish somebody else had come over and share it with you. And if you could get someone to get it, then you'd get away from it and use the other chap. He's already in there and he's in big, deep trouble, so you get in beside him and try not to share it, try and get through. It worked quite successfully, especially in searchlights. As long as you got to the target, got your picture and got out, just survival.
Until deep into 1943, this was the only face of war seen by very many Canadians. Most of our army was still sitting safely in England. After 4 years of war, we lost only about 11,000 dead, less than a fifth of our losses in the same period during the First World War. But so long as this pattern of losses continued, Mackenzie King could go on telling the English-Canadian elite that we were playing our part in the war, while there was no risk of having to impose conscription for overseas service on French Canada. But it was very hard on the air crew. They were providing almost 2/3 of our casualties.
They say 10% got through their first tour and 10% through their second. And
That makes you 1 in 100.
yeah, it's not too many two-tour guys kicking around. In our flight offices, we just took the names off the board, threw them in the fire, moved everybody up so there's no vacancies. Nobody ever said, where's old Joe gone? Or, I wonder if he got away, or is he a prisoner? You just never heard of him again. And in that way, it never got through to anybody.
King stayed lucky for most of the war, but once the bulk of the Canadian Army landed in Normandy in mid-1944, Canadian losses soared.
I had a pipe in my hand, and I lit a cigarette at the same time, and I had a pipe and a cigarette, and everything was a lot of noise, and the Germans shelled us, and I lost about 80% of my company there. And then we were called back. We couldn't carry on with the mission.
When we crossed the St. George, we had 13 men left in the rifle company out of 120.
Yeah. Early in France, after we got into France, we were short of personnel. And at that time, when we needed them,
that's right,
they weren't coming.
Mackenzie King just hung on and hoped the Canadians would not see any more heavy fighting, but they did. The Army ran out of trained volunteers at the Battle of the Scheldt, near the Belgian and Dutch coast, in October 1944.
In fact, it was a dreadful battle because the Germans had flooded large parts of the so-called pocket. He was fighting desperately with his backs to the sea. He had nowhere to go. The trouble was that the weather was against us. There were many days when we couldn't get air support because of cloud and rain. It seemed to me it was raining all the time, which added to the flooding. And the result was that the dike roads were all sitting up, anything from a foot to 10 feet above water. And the fighting had to take place along these exposed roads, and that was a dangerous place to be. It wasn't helped by the fact that we were short of reinforcements, and in many cases the reinforcements we were getting were not adequately trained.
when you think back about some of the things you did and they did to you, it was totally frightening. You weren't frightened, you were petrified every day. Every time you could find some cognac or something, you drank it because you didn't know if tomorrow would ever come or not. You were just petrified. We were only kids.
The reinforcement situation was pretty grim, and they were putting up young officers who really didn't know how to handle themselves in those circumstances. And I tell you, sit around the mess at night with the older guys, trying to buoy the spirits of the new recruits up was a very touching period, because these were kids in 1920, and they'd go out the next day and probably get killed.
We ran into a bunch of Germans, a couple of hundred Germans one night. We were out on a recce, and I used a flamethrower on them, and that made me sick. I tell you, I was crying like a baby when I came back afterwards.
Well, the scheme worked, but not as quickly as I'd been told it was going to work. I remember the general folks had told me that you know, there are only a handful over there, 5,000 or 6,000. You should be able to clean it up in 4 or 5 or 6 days. Well, of course, it took us a month and a lot of casualties. But when it was all over and I went to report personally that that piece of battle was over, and I said to General Folks, I said, you remember those 5,000 or 6,000 Germans you said were on the other side of the canal? He said, yes, what about it? I said, well, we've just taken 12,000 of them prisoner. And he said, don't you talk to me like that, you know. He didn't think it was funny.
The Canadian Army had 20,000 casualties in the Battle of the Scheldt. After 5 years of stalling, the government was finally forced to send conscripts overseas. And everybody waited for a replay of the conscription crisis of 1918. But it didn't happen.
We had bored the country with it. It had been delayed long enough, and it had been evident enough that Mackenzie King was doing everything he could to minimize it, that the resistance didn't develop, really.
King was lucky. The war ended only 6 months after he brought in the conscription bill. So it was a good war for most Canadians. The country prospered mightily, we lost far fewer people than in the First World War, and we felt good about what we had done.
40 years ago, young people of a young country came over here as volunteers to give us freedom. We people of Flanders shall never forget. God bless Canada and the Canadian people.
The Belgians are grateful. Every year, thousands of them show it by marching along the route the Canadian Army followed in the Battle of the Scheldt. They're grateful because they think we did it for them. But Canada actually went into the war mostly out of loyalty to Britain. By the end, of course, we believed we were engaged in a moral crusade against evil. The country had found a new justification for the old habit of sending our soldiers off to war.
For 25 years, Mackenzie King fought a losing battle from this desk to keep Canada out of wars and alliances. Some of his methods were a trifle bizarre, admittedly. He used to discuss world problems regularly with his dear dead mother, and he sought Franklin Roosevelt's advice even more avidly after Roosevelt died. But King lost his battle in the end because the outside forces pulling us into the game were too strong, and because we Canadians ourselves were seduced by our desire to cut a larger figure in the world. At the end of the Second World War, Canada was almost a great power, and although our real military strength drained away very rapidly afterwards, the attitudes that went with it did not. Only 4 years after the war ended, we joined another military alliance, NATO, And since then, we've been loyal, if junior players, in the great power game. For the past 35 years, we've always kept troops overseas, even in peacetime. Now, some people would say this was just a case of Canada growing up and taking its place in the world. But the world isn't in all that great a shape, and maybe we aren't helping either ourselves or anybody else by acting as if we were just another middle-sized European country. So next week, we'll take a look at how we really fell into our present alliances and commitments, and at what other options we might have instead.